Everything moves towards atrophy, doesn't it? Isn't it the second law of thermonuclear dynamics, isn't it? Everything moves towards atrophy. So everything deteriorates, and the intent in humanity will always deteriorate. Unless it's got clear boundaries, unless it lives within clear framework, it will descend into chaos. That's what happens.
Hello and welcome to Sacred Book, in which two ex-military respectfully have a conversation about the Bible, both the New Testament and the Tanakh, from a Christian perspective, which is
me, Steve,
and from an atheistic perspective, which is myself, Mark. Welcome. This will cover all of the New Testament and the Old Testament and beyond. There's an enigmatic line in Genesis 6 in which the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So we thought this would be an ideal opportunity to talk about evil. Does evil exist?
Yes. Evil exists.
Okay, that's the end of that then. So thank you very much, and thank you.
There we go. That was a very short, wasn't it? Is evil real? Does it exist? I would have to say yes. Evil is definitely real, and evil definitely exists. How evil then manifests itself is a different thing again. But I do believe that we live in a cosmos, in a world, in a structure where evil is very real. And I don't just say that from a sort of philosophical or theological perspective. I say that from what I have seen or I have experienced in my working life. I have met people, and there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that these people harboured evil intent within them in the way that they conducted themselves, in the actions that they carried out, and in the way that they projected. There is no doubt in my mind. When you have been around people who are pretty dark, you don't have a problem with going, yep, there's some pretty evil crap that happens in the world.
It's probably worth interjecting here for those who are listening, perhaps for the first time, are not aware of the fact that Steve has been a detective long-standing for decades. We both served in the Royal Navy in the 1980s. Steve has been a detective pretty much from, the early 90s onwards. So you would have come across, just by people being questioned or interrogated. What's the word? You don't say interrogated. What do you say? Beaten to a...
No, we don't beat people. We stopped doing that when Pace came in.
Yeah. You would have come across some pretty hard types. Were those people evil within, or were they prodded by something external to themselves that we could classify as evil?
I guess it will depend as well on what your worldview is, won't it? A atheist or a naturalist, naturalism as opposed to naturist.
You never know, they could be the same.
In that evil is just pain in a world of pain. You know, survival of the fittest, nature is red in tooth and claw, and all of that sort of thing. But even then, atheism does not actually answer that very well, in my understanding of it, because it collapses too many other things. If there is evil, and if evil is real, then there's got to be an absolute standard by which evil is known, and then an absolute good by which evil is counterposed against. This yin and yang. There's these opposites, these polarities. I don't believe you can have good without evil. I don't believe that you can have absolute good without absolute evil. I see that there is balance going on between those two opposing forces. It doesn't seem to me that it's a bit of both, or a lesser good here and a greater evil there, or a lesser evil here and a greater good here.
Yeah.
I see it as complete for whatever reason, and that's a different thing. Does that make sense to you?
Makes perfect sense. And I have to say that unlike yourself, I've not come across the types of persons you've had to deal with in my life. I assume it's a blessing. If I've come across anybody who I would think, they've got real ill intent, it's very rare, and it tends to be people that have been at work, could have been a work colleague or something. They may have been pilfering from the till, so to speak. That obviously is going to colour the way I look at the world. Also, because part of my degree was theology and philosophy, I probably look at it too intellectual rather than a practical level. As what one of the criticisms was put at people like Plato and Socrates. Aristophanes did this great play called The Clouds, and it's poking fun at Socrates, who's sat in the clouds and he's in this thinkery, and he's just coming out with a load of hot air. So I might run the risk of being too out there.
Mm.
Evil is one of those concepts that's often known as the problem of evil. And you come across it, don't you, with debates
Mm.
where there's going to be one side, how could the church say there's a God who's all powerful and all loving if there's evil, and then there's the opposed, saying pithy statements trying to get the audience to laugh or agree with them. Is there a problem with evil? I would say only in the West, only in the monotheistic religions. It tends not to be something that causes so much angst in the East. Yes, Taoism, which I know you're reading about at the moment, Tao Te Ching, and Hinduism, they have the concept that there is suffering, natural suffering, as we do in the West, as in the monotheistic religions. And when I say monotheistic, I mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Take, for instance, the 2004 tsunami. I was teaching religious studies in the UK, and I had children come up to me and say, "Oh, that proves there's no God then. Where was God when all the suffering took place?" I said, "Why do you think that was anything to do with God or not?" He said, "Well, God made this world, didn't he? So why has he made it so that there's suffering?" And then you have these conversations where you say, "Well, look, would you rather live on a dead rock? We live on a planet with an internal core that allows us to live on the surface. Anybody will tell you heat rises. Therefore, there's going to be the stress of a planet that is alive. There is going to be volcanic activity. There is going to be earthquakes. Because we're revolving, which is why we get day and night, wind is created. Therefore, you're going to get storms. That's natural. Don't blame God for that. Just because there's a disaster and many people have been killed, don't put the blame at God. Rather, and this is where a lot of people who want to knock the idea of God don't like to go to, look at the response that people gave, the charity, the helping, the wanting to go out there and do something. That, if anywhere, is where God was, not in the disaster. There are two types of evil. We need to distinguish them. Natural suffering and moral evil. So I'll end on the natural suffering for now. What do you think?
I would not disagree with those sort of general categories, I don't think. There is obviously natural suffering. And again, it all depends on how you view the world. And we've discussed this in terms of the functional setup in Genesis and what that looks like. If we believe, as I would say, that the world is not perfect and the world is labouring, waiting to come into the fullness of its ultimate purpose and design, like a lady who is pregnant and is waiting to give birth to the child, there is this labor period which is going on in the world, which is why the contractions come, because it's looking to birth something and bring something new. And I believe that that is the state that the material world is in terms of natural disasters. It is laboring and it is groaning, waiting to deliver something new. And that newness will be the regeneration of this planet when the God-man steps back into time and space and makes things new. Now, that's the Christian belief. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that's the Christian belief. And I'm not saying you should agree with me. That's your choice, because I believe that we have choice. And so where was God in these things? I think that the material side you can park, while it's something you can argue about. I think that Christianity actually gives you a very good perspective on. So I've seen great evil. Where was God? Well, God was in the uniforms of the men and the women who jumped in and got involved and rescued people and saved people. God was in the fluoro vests of humanity who put themselves at risk. God is in the nurses and the doctors who have put themselves on the front line against all sorts of pandemics and other bits and pieces. Where is God? God is shown day to day in the presentation within humanity of all that is good. And because of what I believe a Christian should be, that to me sits absolutely squarely and perfectly with God in action in this world, because God works through people. God, for whatever reason, has chosen to work through human agency in this world until a time comes yet future when he will once again intervene. So again, I see God at work in lots of ways, lots of good ways, mitigating against evil. The Roman Epicurean Lucretius, the poet Lucretius, who I'm sure you well know, says, had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see. Well, that's fine. That's a great thing that you can chuck out at people, but it doesn't actually really provide a significant answer. And I don't think it actually deals with the question of real evil in the world. But If you were to look at it from the materialistic perspective, if you were to look at it from the theological perspective and the philosophy that goes around that, evil is not just something that you can blame God for. C.S. Lewis, in his Problem of Pain, writes about this. God could make it so that a wooden beam became as soft as grass when it was used as a weapon, and the air refused to obey me if I attempted to set it up in the sound waves that carry lies or insults. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, and in which, therefore, freedom of will would be void. So C.S. Lewis comes to this view that if God were to constantly intervene, like some people want, why did God allow? Why did God? Where do we draw that line? Yes, let's have God intervene in stopping a terrorist blow people up, but let's not have God intervene when I tell a lie. If God constantly intervenes so that no evil consequences could follow from the choices that we make, then that would make what goes on in us, the formation of our character, the sanctification of our character, the mind, the will, the emotions, it would make that impossible to grow. It's through our choices that we grow and develop and that we become better people.
You talked about the woman pregnant giving birth. I don't know why. I thought of James Lovelock. He came up with the Gaia hypothesis that the Earth is a living organism. And it's interesting that you linked that to a profound period of gestation before it reaches its endpoint. Look, I know the Gaia hypothesis doesn't really go that way, but for some reason it came to my mind. The thing about evil, you touched on, C.S. Lewis talked about will. You could also say free will. This is the key aspect that I've always focused on, that in the East there is no concept of a evil force exterior to ourselves. We have free will, we're moral agency, and then we decide. And of course, someone like Hitler or someone despicable, serial murder or something, they can really go to extremes, but it's their free will. They don't have to do that. They've decided to do that for whatever reason. So I struggle to see that there's an exterior evil. You can't blame somebody, oh, the devil made me do it. But I bring it back to Christianity, and I think about Genesis that we've just covered. On day 1 to 5, there's no humans. We don't come into the scene until day 6. Is there evil during days 1 to 5? A bird would have killed an animal for food. Is that evil? If it happens now in our world, is that evil? Or is that just the natural order of stuff? What if a human on day 6 killed a goat for meat? Is that evil when we kill animals? And I do appreciate the fact that in law, if somebody went and stole somebody else's goat and killed it, that could be a crime. We're killing animals all the time. Or is it evil because it's human against human? Is that what makes evil for us in this instance? And is it relative? We both served in the military. If we were ashore and we visited a place and suddenly someone on a rooftop has got a gun and starts shooting at us, kills a couple of people we know, we would consider that to be evil. But if we were in uniform and it's a war and they're the enemy and they're shooting at us, do we see that the same? Or if we were shooting back and killed them, we'd probably get a medal. So is it relative? Is evil case by case in that, yes, it's people doing horrible things to people, but it depends on the situation. But more importantly, and the reason I say this is because I appeal to you now as a detective, a long-standing, I don't know about New Zealand, but in Britain, there were things that you could be put in prison for that you wouldn't in France or Spain or Germany. Who decides what is evil? Is there an absolute benchmark, and then who decides? What's that predicated on? Or is there no absolute, and it's case by case?
I think the problem comes as if we throw away absolutes, we end up in the chaos that we see the Western world in now, because there is no longer an absolute, and therefore people have no longer got anything to actually set benchmarks on, and what is my right is right, and what is your right is right, and what is my truth is true, and what is your truth is true, and we end up in a total spiral going nowhere. I think it was Martin Luther King who, when he was arrested, he made the comment that he may well have been arrested under the laws of Alabama, but there is a law above the law of Alabama, and it is this transcendent law that we are answerable to. And whether you like it, whether you don't, whether you're a monarchist, whether you're not. I think one of the staggering things of the coronation that we saw of King Charles was that he was stripped down to his undergarments and presented as the equivalent of naked before this authority that sits above him. And within that ceremony, within that tradition, there was a very tacit acknowledgement that above the head of our state is a law that that person is subservient to. And we've lost that in the West. We've lost that respect, I think, and belief, because we've thrown out religion. I've not got a problem with people throwing out religion if that's what they want to do. But with throwing out religion, they've thrown out the baby with the bathwater, because it's very difficult to hang absolutes in anything now, on anything, because whose version is it? You would say this, I would say this. Well, I'm right, you're right. And we see this played out across society now, that people are just getting in such a muddle, such a mess in so many different areas of life. Blokes don't know what it means to be a bloke anymore. Masculinity is considered to be toxic. Everything that happened in the past is my fault. If you're a white male, 50-something-year-old, then you are responsible for all of the hell on earth. And it's just such absolute nonsense. We need to sort of peel back from that. How society's ever going to do that, I don't know. But I think that by throwing out absolutes has speeded this process of chaos up. And I think that unless we can actually hang on something far bigger than us, we are always going to struggle. The point that you made about setting rights, where it's right in this country, but it's wrong in that country. So there is clearly a cultural setting that you would go to. In some Islamic countries, it's okay for you to have a number of wives. In Western countries, mostly you don't have a number of wives because it's called bigamy. You have one wife, but then Western countries get around that by having strings of mistresses, which is the same principle, but without any of the paperwork. So there are different cultural rules. But taking it right back to taking a life or something like that, in the police, you could kill somebody and it wouldn't necessarily be murder because you might do it accidentally. And all of this stems actually from very clear Judeo-Christian principles, which have been written down hundreds, thousands of years before. But what defines the difference between what is sort of bad, what is just an accident, what is a mistake, is something called malice aforethought. You would have in your mind an intent in your heart to do something which was wrong, and you knew it was wrong, and you then set the boundaries. And like I've talked about to you before, you'd have sin, iniquity, and transgression. And these were 3 steps on the way: sin, iniquity, transgression. The transgression was the actual act that you eventually carry out, having now you set the rules, you set the boundaries, you set the framework. But to do that, you'd be hooked in with sin, i.e. what your eye hooks onto. Then iniquity would be the fantasy that you build up around it. And then the transgression is then when you actually carry the act out, the actus reus, the actual act of the event. And that's a very clear Hebraic concept of understanding how we traverse into a state of evil, is having a thought evil. Well, you can't stop thought. So I'm not so sure that having a thought is evil, but having a thought, building on that thought, then carrying out that act, that malice aforethought, that's when you almost manifest the evil. You build the evil into your actions. And when you take a human life, if you have gone through those steps, sin, iniquity, transgression, then you have committed an act, I believe, of great evil. And why would I say it's an act of great evil and distinguish that from killing an animal for food or something like that? Well, an animal is not made in the image of God. And I believe that humanity is endowed with the image of God. So in effect, what you are doing is you are spitting in the face of God, as well as robbing somebody of their God-given life and potential. I have a very high view of humanity in terms of their intrinsic value. I believe everybody has huge value, intrinsic value. That doesn't mean to say I believe everybody is good. I don't believe everybody's good at all, but I do believe that even somebody who is not good is of intrinsic value. I would like to see within them there is that spark of divinity, which is the image that they're created in, the image of God.
Oh, very good. I'm just going to push back on something you said. Not that I disagree with you.
Push away.
No, because it's not going to disagree with you. Well, not fully. So, Charles's coronation, he was stripped down. And as you say, that was quite a remarkable scene. In a way, he has to humble himself in front of the concept of God. And there has to be a higher authority. I agree with that. I mean, somebody's listening to this again for the first time in the future. I say I'm the atheist point of view, but I'm actually an atheist that believes in God. That will confuse a few people. So I accept that there has to be something beyond the times, the personalities of now and the future. So that there's always something that we collectively could say rides above any person that will claim to grab power. I agree with that. But what I find very striking about that coronation, and I Would have to find the scene again just to make sure, but I'm sure the bishops that were with him said it's the God of Great Britain. Not God, the God of Great Britain. Equally, they could have said, if it was like in Albania, oh, the Albanian God, as though, hang on, isn't... Why are you making God exclusive just for one set of people? Because obviously he has to be a defender of the Anglican Church. But it just seems something, oh, all right, that's a point to debate on later, perhaps. I would have thought they would have said God. The other thing is, with morals, as you were talking, and I can't remember now what you said for me to write this down, there's a saying that we often considered during my study of philosophy. Food first, then morals. We, in a way, in the West, well, around the world now, are in a unique position that we've got enough comfort that we can think to a high level about morality. But let us not forget that if there was an apocalypse now and people were struggling for food, all this morality debate would go out the window. It will be the survival of the fittest. So in a way, we've constructed these things because we have the capacity of a community to do so, which is a good thing. And also I agree with the intrinsic value. What is unique about the Bible and Jesus is that they teach us that we should elevate all people to see them as worth. And therefore, if you forget that we're all in the image of God, that is evil. Because what you're saying is that, oh, you look different to me. I'm in power, therefore I'm going to treat you like an animal, a slave, lesser than somebody else. That, I think, is the key here. What is evil? Anyone who does that. And it is evil when you start putting your power over others. And boy, despite the fact of 2,000 years of debate, despite the fact that whatever you do gets instantly telegraphed around the world, there are people in the West who openly now ignore that. And it's amazing that we're in that position.
Yeah, you're right. It is absolutely amazing. And it is an absolute indictment on the leadership of people in the West. We have got a group of people who are very wealthy, very powerful, very elite, and they are very, very out of touch with what happens on the ground in reality. And we are seeing such a divide in society. The poor are getting poorer, the rich are getting richer, and the middle is getting stretched. And most of the middle is dropping to the bottom, I think, becoming much poorer. So I think that we've got huge problems there. And I think that if we continue to jettison God, we have jettisoned any thought of the sacred. We have jettisoned any higher being that we may one day be answerable to, or who transcends what we think, and it's all about us. We are on a slippery, slippery slope. I think it was Nietzsche, wasn't it, talking about the death of God. I think he's quite misunderstood in terms of his anti-Christian rhetoric. He didn't like the institution of Christianity for very good reasons because of what they were pushing. And his death of God was almost a lament that God was going to be dead, because what on earth was going to fill that gap? What on earth would step into that void? Well, we're seeing what's stepping into that void, and it's not good. People can bang religion for as much as they want, but the 20th century was the bloodiest century in history in terms of people killed, as I understand it. And none of that was done in the name of Jesus.
Yes, and again, I 100% agree with you. But what's interesting, you only have to go back to debates, especially with Christopher Hitchens, for all his popularity, and there's a lot I agree with. He would like to point out that, well, the Nazis, they were supported by the Catholic Church. I'm not sure on that. And I think it's Gott mit uns, God with us, which was on the buckles of the army, as though that proved that they were all religious. I don't know. It's open to debate with some people whether what you've said is correct. I think you are correct, but it's amazing how even that's not agreed upon.
Well, I guess anybody that rides into battle professing love for God, love for their neighbour, and then slaughters innocents, sticks babies on spikes, sends 6 million Jews into the gas chamber, is not professing or showing the faith that I would declare and that I would believe in, and that I see as part of the beautiful history of the Christian church in terms of what Christianity is about. Nor indeed many of the other religions who promote a brotherhood of humanity in a way that supports people. I think that people will always turn a religious tune, if you like, to support their cause. But when their cause is actually about humanistic conquest, it's about robbing people, it's about stealing resources, it's about taking over land and subjecting people. I struggle with that. I certainly don't see that as a Christian way of living your life. And many other followers of other faiths would say, no, we don't agree with that either. We think that's crap. And I would stand with them on that, even though I disagree with them on other things. So whether Hitler chose to use a slanted version of Christianity to push his agenda, maybe he did, but his agenda was godless. And you look at communism, how many lives have been taken through communism? That's an atheistic belief. There is no God. That's down to humanity. That's down to humans. It's down to the human condition. I think that before we blame God about what's going on in the world, we need to look at humans and go, humanity, you sort your crap out first before you start blaming a transcendent being. And if you don't even believe in a transcendent being, then don't even bother to blame them. Because what's the point? It'd be like blaming fairies in your back garden for putting weeds in there. You just can't do it. If you have no belief in God, don't ever blame God. Look at what's going on with humanity and blame humanity. Don't blame God.
You mentioned Friedrich Nietzsche. His statement was, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred game shall we have to invent? Is not the greatest of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? So he was quite scathing of what we've done to destroy the concept that there is a God, and because we've killed it. Probably none more so during the 20th century.
Yeah. What sacred game shall we have to invent? Humanity. And this is the problem. We are now inventing rules, regulations, laws, which are going to all fall over. I have very little doubt about that, I'm afraid. Because I do believe that there are absolutes. I believe that it is absolutely wrong to do certain things, which means there is an absolute right and there is an absolute wrong. I don't believe that there are any circumstances anywhere, ever, at any time when it is right to carry out certain things. And, you know, the usual things around children would come into play around that. You know, they are totally wrong at any time in any culture. These things are just such a horrible display of what humanity can sink to. As you pointed out, it's great to sit and moralize. It's great to sit and philosophize when you're sat in a world where you can do so. But when you've got forbidden rabid savages at your door trying to break in and steal your food, you know, morals can go out the window. And we see this. And it doesn't take long to unravel a society. It didn't take long for Hitler to unravel the German society and to get them to get alongside him and allow people to be marched into a gas chamber. It didn't take long, not many years. How quickly people can be turned against each other just through what we have seen over the last 3 to 4 years. Who will be standing and picking up the pieces? Who will be going out into the crappy areas and helping people? Who will be displaying love to their neighbour in a world where that happens? I hope that it's the Christian and the people of faith.
It's interesting how quickly it can descend. I remember Hurricane Katrina that hit New Orleans. And someone wrote, this is using old style terminology now, they wrote at the time, it took 2 days for that whole area to descend from a first world nation to a third world. And there were murders being committed that have never been brought to justice because no one knew who they were. But there were some 2 or 3 people obviously committing mass murder because they took the opportunity to do so. It just descends into chaos very quickly, and we know that with our own cyclone that hit New Zealand. If you don't mind, I'm going to bring back now to the point where we're at. In the future, this will make no sense whatsoever. But currently, we're talking pre-flood. This is what brought us to record this about, and the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Almost a circularity of what Nietzsche was saying. I wonder if it was very similar then, as it's always been throughout. There's always these inflection points where we just descend into utmost, I don't know what the word is, ignoring what's good for us.
Everything moves towards atrophy, doesn't it? Isn't it the second law of thermonuclear physics or something like that? It's all about thermodynamics, isn't it? Everything moves towards atrophy. So everything deteriorates, and the intent in humanity will always deteriorate. Unless it's got clear boundaries, unless it lives within clear framework, it will descend into chaos. That's what happens. There's often seen as a contradiction, isn't there, with the existence of having evil if you are a theist in a sort of theistic structure. Philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who is a very famous philosopher, presents an argument which is very, very simple in support of theism and the understanding of evil in theism. And he says this: the all-powerful, all-good God created the universe. There you go. There's your first point. Point two, God has permitted evil and has a good reason for doing so. Point three, therefore, there is no contradiction in theism. It's a very solid logical possibility. No necessary contradiction in that. And then this set of ideas is forever shown to be consistent. And if we go back to the beginning, which I touched on with Genesis, if this is a world which is still waiting to be birthed into the fullness of its creative state, then God has very good reason for permitting what goes on in that labour period. Labour for a woman, as I understand it, is not good. I mean, man, it hurt my hand with my wife's nails going into me and that sort of thing, and that was really painful. So
Yeah, you had to sit down afterwards.
I had to go and sit down. I said, "Oh, love, let go! You're hurting me, And she's like, "Oh, I'm going to hurt you, all right?" But anyway, there's that period, isn't there, where this pain is permitted. That pain is part of the process, and who knows what that pain's for. There's a lovely little poem. It's called The Weaver. I don't know if you're aware of that poem, The Weaver. It says this: no. My life is but a weaving between my Lord and me. I cannot choose the colours. He worketh steadily. Oft times he weaveth sorrow, and I, in foolish pride, forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the looms are silent, and the shuttle cease to fly, will God unroll the canvas and explain the reason why the dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skilful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. You know, we are a tapestry made up of multiple threads and colours and thicknesses, and if we're looking at the back of the tapestry, we're going, man, this is chaos. One day the tapestry will be shown, and all of those different colours, all of those horrible things that make up pain and aggravation in our life will form part of the whole. And I think that that's where we go one day, and we'll understand.
I don't think we'll ever agree what evil really is. This is one of those wonderful topics that makes theology so fantastic, because it's open to debate. And as time moves on, we get new thinking, new ideas. I mean, we've quoted a few people from the 20th century, the 19th century. So in the future, there's going to be somebody like yourself, Steve, who's going to be writing about this kind of topic. And people will be citing years from now because new ideas have come out. But I just find it fascinating for myself that when you read or reread the Bible as we're doing, they were talking about this 4,000 years ago, and nothing's really changed.
The truths of Scripture are timeless, mate.
God has got the patience of God.
Yeah, indeed.
So, Steve, I think we've answered fully, as much as we can possibly do right now. No doubt this will be a topic we'll come back to later. But for now, I think it's farewell.
Yep, thanks for that, mate. It was always good to catch up with you. I'll speak to you later again. Well,
take care.
Take care, bye.